We're going to roll with Dr. Alicia Deal and Mr. Clayton Nicolardi. So Dr. Alicia Deal is a drinking water specialist with a master's and PhD in drinking water treatment. Starting in 1997, she worked for the TCEQ in various compliance and assistance roles. Since retiring in 2016, she has been a contractor on the Texas Optimization Program. Mr. Nicolardi is a senior engineer with the TCEQ's Office of Water Supply Division, Emergency Preparedness and Response Section. He is a graduate of the University of Texas at Austin and a U.S. Army veteran. He has worked for the TCEQ for 18 years, 16 of which have been spent assisting public water systems across the state. Clayton is also a licensed surface water treatment operator and has worked in the private sector as an operator and a consulting engineer. He enjoys hobbies such as spending time with family, hunting, and fishing. Please welcome Alicia Deal and Clayton Nicolardi.
All right, so this is a continuation kind of from the last talk. We kind of foreshadowed with the fear of nitrification knocking out residuals. So we're going to get into that more and talk about the nitrification action plans that you can use, that you're actually required to have and hopefully do use to keep that nitrification from making you have a bad day. So first, we'll go ahead and talk about what is this nitrification that we're talking about here? Who can it impact, and just briefly talk about the biology. There will not be a quiz. And then who needs a nitrification action plan? And the elements that go into that, the goals, baselines, triggers, and then the actions that you take when something triggers that action. And then finally, we'll kind of put that all together in a fancy little matrix that puts all of that information in one place. So the first question, I mean, who needs a nitrification action plan? It's really anybody that has chloramines in their distribution system. So, you know, even if you had no wells, if you just purchase and redistribute chloraminated water, got to have a nitrification action plan. If you have groundwater wells that have ammonia in them and you put free chlorine in and it mixes up to make chloramines, got to have a nitrification action plan. The water does not care who owns it. The water's just the water. So if there's chloramines, there's this potential of nitrification, and so you got to have a plan to deal with it. Just like any emergency plan, we're talking a lot about emergency plans nowadays, and this is kind of one of them. So nitrification, the shortest answer possible is that there are these bacteria that like to eat ammonia. And so it's a biological process driven by bacteria. And when there's ammonia around, that is food for these little guys. The long answer, we'll give you a bunch more slides in a minute. That'll be a whole presentation in itself. So why would we care? Why is this a problem in a distribution system? The reason that this is a risk is that loss of residual that comes along with it. And it's not something that they don't eat the chlorine, but it's like, for example, if you're eating a hamburger and the hamburger has lettuce on it, you could care less about lettuce. You're all about the bacon and cheese, right? That's cool. But you're not going to scrape that lettuce off. You're going to go ahead and eat the whole hamburger and eat the lettuce. And that's kind of like these bacteria. They want to eat the ammonia. Yum, that's a delicious hamburger. But the chloramines come along with it, and they just accidentally eat it while they're eating the hamburger, or ammonia. So we have to have that disinfectant residual in there. Like Janelle this morning, Janelle Crane in the plenary session, she was like, you're all public health professionals. Absolutely. You know, we're all in the business of keeping our families, our communities safe. And part of that is having a disinfectant residual in the distribution system to knock out any potential, little bad bugs, right? So I mean, obviously that leads to, you've got that regrowth of bacteria, and that's where Clayton was kind of foreshadowing the potential for some coliform hits there, and with the low residual, either one of those can drive you down a street that you don't want to go down, where you're potentially, either having a compliance issue or a actual do not use or boil issue. So if there are chloramines present in your system, there's gonna be some ammonia, and so anybody, regardless of where that water's from, it doesn't care who owns it, it could possibly have nitrification. So that's all of these guys that I was talking about, any system with chloramines. Now, if there's a potential risk to public health, there's usually some kind of rule that goes along with it, right? That's how our whole industry is driven, is we find out about some illness or some kind of negative adverse public health endpoint, and we're like, we gotta do something about that. And it's the same thing here. So what we did here, it's like, not every system is the same, and Texas is like, 5 times bigger than any other state, and well, we don't count Alaska because it's all snow, right? And so you've got all these different waters that you could be dealing with, and so rather than say you must do these exact things, it's more like, okay, well, you gotta do something. You've gotta have a plan for your water, your distribution system, to deal with the potential that you get this nitrification, basically to keep your folks safe and keep yourself from having that bad day. So following that nitrification action plan is what you do to stay away from the loss of residual. So now let's get into the longer answer of, okay, Alicia, what the heck is that nitrification that you're talking about? So it's a biological process, and now there's 2 steps here. The first one that I was talking about was that ammonia oxidizing bacteria. They see that ammonia as food. And so these little AOBs, or ammonia oxidizing bacteria, they're like chomp, 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 chomp on the nitrogen in the ammonia. And what they do inside their little tiny body is they change that into nitrite, NO2-, nitrite with only 2 oxygens. Well, it turns out that they've got a family member, the nitrite oxidizing bacteria, or NOB. Those little guys, the NOB, they see that nitrite and they're like, ooh, yum, that's so delicious. And so they eat that nitrite, and in the process, they stick another oxygen on it, and it turns into nitrate, okay? So you've just got these crazy little bugs. In the process, like I say, the disinfecting monochloramine is destroyed. So let's talk about those reactions a little bit more. So the normal chloramine reactions in the monochloramine zone, this is even with a good monochloramine residual. We're not talking unstable here, we're talking good monochloramines. So we have, this is the correct backwards, but you see, we've got, if we do this backwards, you'll see over on the farthest right, you have ammonia, and then if you go backwards, you have hypochlorous acid, right? And usually, like in the last presentation where we're talking about forming monochloramine, hypochlorous acid plus ammonia equals the first chemical up there, right? 1N, 1Cl, what's that? Monochloramine. 2 little hydrogens to balance things out. But there's 2 arrows in the middle, right? One pointing one way and one pointing the other way. Now, we should really make the arrow that points to monochloramine bigger, because when this reaction happens, it mostly goes towards the side with monochloramine on it, okay? Towards the NH2Cl, right? But it can go both ways. It's an equilibrium. So a little bit of this is always going to be going back into the ammonia and hypochlorous acid. And that means that in any chloraminated system, you're going to see a little ammonia being released as that chloramine decays, that arrow. And so there's ammonia there, which could be food, right? The other thing that happens is that, you know, families, right? So monochloramine, it'll actually fight with itself. One of the ways that it decays is you have two monochloramines over here on the left, and they get in a little heaver-hover, and one tries to react with the other, and what happens is they're gonna form dichloramine, and in the process, they form a little bit of ammonia. A little bit of ammonia is food, right? So we've just gone and made some potential food for our ammonia oxidizing bacteria. Well, nitrification will draw that equation as well. Now we've got a little bit of ammonia for food, and we're talking about such low concentrations that just the dissolved oxygen that's in our water is enough for that to react and have those ammonia oxidizing bacteria, AOB, eat that and produce the nitrite, 2 O's nitrite, and a little bit of hydrogen ion and some electrons. Well, now we have some nitrite. So what are we going to do with the nitrite? Well, if the ammonia oxidizing bacteria's little brother nitrite oxidizing bacteria is there, it's going to eat that nitrite and make nitrate, okay? NO3 minus is nitrate. I wish that they'd named these chemicals things that were more different, like Bob and Ken and Sean, but it's got to be nitrite and nitrate. Well, eventually I'll get it straight. So this is a biological reaction. The AOB eats the ammonia, the AOB makes nitrite, the NOB eats nitrite, and the NOB makes nitrate. So that's just putting it all in one picture. And in the process, they eat the lettuce, the monochloramine is destroyed. Now, this is a natural process that happens everywhere that water is around. We talked about the wastewater guys earlier, right? So they had actually a whole lot to say about nitrification, but they actually use it in plants. Has anybody who has a wastewater license dealt with Sure. But we're talking about just this natural process. And in the environment, here we are in a beautiful little stream. Clayton's gonna go fishing here in a minute because there's some beautiful little fish and some happy little seaweed trees. And we've got ammonia in here though. And how did we get ammonia? Well, there's effluent, there could be runoff. There's also plant remnants, and then fish excreta will cause ammonia to be present in a natural stream. Now, these nitrous ammonious, or AOB, the ammonia oxidizing bacteria, are going to eat that ammonia and form nitrite. Then there's nitrite available, so the NOB, or nitrobacter, are going to eat that nitrite and form nitrate. But the thing is that in the natural environment, you've got all this biological activity going on. So there's other organisms, like especially down in the silt and the benthic layer in the anoxic zone, where they can take that nitrate and turn it back into fertilizer for these other happy seaweed and happy fish, and everything's all balanced out. Problem is that in our pipes, well, we hopefully don't have happy little seaweed and happy little fish, or your problems are different than this talk, okay? If you find the goldfish, call Clayton, all right? But we've still got bacterial life, right? Mainly in the biofilm on the pipe. So cleaner is better, but every pipe is gonna have some little biofilm there. You might not even see it. It might be one bacteria deep. Do we have ammonia? Well, yeah, I mean, we could have the naturally occurring that we talked about, but we're also actually adding some, and we've got that decomposition of chloramines that forms a little bit of ammonia. So that means that's gonna jumpstart this whole process, and it's gonna happen in that biofilm. The bacteria, they're the same guys that we saw in the happy little stream that Clayton was fishing in. But with us, what this causes in this non-natural environment is the loss of residual that we fear. So we need to be able to detect nitrification. If we can find it, we can fix it. If we don't look for it or don't find it, it's going to be a lot harder to fix it. So the monitoring that we talked about in the last presentation, we just want to add a little bit to that. So we can detect that nitrification. So we're going to keep track of the total and the mono and the ammonia like we talked about in the last presentation, but we want to add to that nitrite and nitrate, okay? And what we want to do is if we have abnormal levels, we're going to want to take some action to make things right, all right? So what is I say normal conditions versus abnormal conditions, what do I mean? So as water age goes up in normal situations, you are going to see your total chlorine residual. Is it going to go up or down? Down, right? Because it just decays. Stuff does, right? Monochloramine, down or up? I heard a down. Free available ammonia, down or up? I heard someone say up. That's right, because the chloramine is decaying, the monochloramine is decaying, and remember I showed that equilibrium, that it makes a little food, it makes a little ammonia, it's actually going up. So longer water age, you're gonna see higher ammonia than you see at your entry points. Now what the heck is nitrite gonna do? Well, it's gonna stay the same, and so is nitrate. Now why do I say that? These things, they're in normal conditions, there's no biological activity. Normal means no nitrification. There's no activity that would make them go down or up. They're just like salt. If you had salt in your system, your water would be just as salty at the far reaches as it is at the entry point. They're inorganic chemicals. They don't change under normal circumstances. And it looks like this, right? So you've got the mono and the total. There's a little difference there. How many of y'all have a little difference between your mono and your total? Several. And then, of course, the people that don't raise their hands. But you're seeing as the mono and total decay, they're throwing off a little bit of ammonia. So you see that red line there is the ammonia coming up a little bit as the water ages, okay? Making a little bit more food. Nitrate and nitrite, those two green lines with the squares across the bottom, just the same. Nothing biological going on in this water whatsoever. Good day, this is. Water age is increasing across the x-axis. Now, under abnormal conditions, as water age goes up, what's total chlorine residual going to go? Down or up? I heard down, right? Down farther. This is why we're worried. What about monochloramine? Same deal, right? Free available ammonia. This is the tricky one. Yeah, now instead of going up like it did under normal conditions, it's going down. 'Cause why? Yeah, chomp, chomp, chomp. What about nitrite? What's nitrite gonna do? So the ammonia oxidizing bacteria, they're chomp, chomp, chomping, and they're throwing off nitrite, right? So conceivably, we could see them go up. Now, why would they then turn around and start going down? There you go, NOBs. You got it in one, man. So they go up when nitrification is really well established. You're going to see that nitrate start peaking up a little bit. And what it's going to look like in a picture is more like this, right? You're losing your darn residual, especially at high water age locations. And you can see that little red line. You can see now the ammonia is going down as those bugs, the AOBs, are chomp, chomp, chomp. And the green lines, instead of staying stable like they did when there was no biological activity in that water whatsoever, now you see that lower line is the lower light green squares. It comes up a little, and then it drops, and then the nitrate, the darker green, it comes up towards the end of the system where nitrification is really bad. And this is a bad day, as you can see. One problem that we've faced over time, we've learned a lot about this trying to help folks. Low residuals can happen for other reasons besides just nitrification. And so there's some clues where you can detect other causes of low residuals. One of them, if you're close to a plant where the amount of chlorine entering that water could be changing, like the example that we talked about last presentation about the free chlorine water hitting the chloramine water. In that location, there was instability in the chloramines, and so we had unstable water, and we could see a loss of residual there. If we had a backflow condition with something that had high demand, we've got a little crack in a pipe. You've got a pipe in this caliche up here in central Texas, and it's dry as heck, and it's not bedded right, and you got a big old crack in that pipe, and it's sucking in a bunch of caliche and mud with a bunch of demand, right? Maybe some iron in that mud. Well, you could have a loss of residual in that situation that didn't have anything to do with nitrification. So we've got to be able to use our detective skills to figure that out. So the data can tell us the chemical cues that will help us detect whether it's nitrification or not. First of all, the thing that is going to send us out looking for this is going to be the loss of chloramine residual. The disappearance of ammonia where we expect to see ammonia. You usually see 0.4 at the far reaches. Now you're only seeing 0.1. What's happening? A change in nitrite or nitrate. Nitrite up or down, nitrate up. Nitrate, that number is really low, but little changes. Like it's usually 0.01 and now it's 0.1. You can't just go, oh, those are both small numbers. Well, 0.1 is 10 times 0.01, so. And then with nitrite, a subsequent decrease later. Remember when we showed those the equations? One of the things we saw was hydrogen ion coming up in some waters. In waters that don't have a lot of buffer capacity, and this is going to be especially East Texas, and we have reports where sometimes it's really a significant pH decrease that you can see when nitrification is occurring. So this is a great thing to check for. pH is a cheap, fast thing you can analyze for that can be a real help in your detective abilities. There's also biological cues. If you're into biology, man, you can look for the microbial regrowth that's happening, and that may come the bad way, which is total coliform detects, which you kind of don't want. But you can also see that if you're doing heterotrophic plate count bacteria measurements, or some folks have gotten to the point where they got fancy machines that'll actually tell you if those individual microorganisms, the AOB or the NOB, are actually there. So, and 10 years from now, you'll have your phone and you'll just dip it in the water and it'll tell you. Oh, oops. I hope I didn't take too much time. So it may be nitrification if the total chlorine is too low, the monochloramine is too low, but they're the normal relationship, and the ammonia is too low because they're eating the ammonia. If the nitrite's higher or lower than normal in the nitrate, if the nitrate is higher, either one. Unstable chlorine, you're going to see that nitrate and nitrite staying right where they were at. Those don't get involved in that unstable chloramine at all. The increased demand, you're going to see the nitrate and nitrite staying the same again because mud doesn't have a nitrate or nitrite demand. Okay, so you see what I'm pointing out here is the importance of nitrite and nitrate monitoring. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Clayton Nicolardi to talk about the nitrification action plan itself and how that's going to help you do that detective work that you need to do to figure out the whole deal.
Okay, thanks Alicia. So in the interest of time, I'll just go ahead. Some of these are fly-in, so I'm going to put them all up and then talk about them. So in the chloramine presentation, we really went over chloramine effectiveness sampling, what you need to sample for parameters, picking out critical sample sites and the like, sample frequency and schedules, and a list of analytical methods. But in this presentation, we're going to talk about NAP in terms of matrix, developing a matrix showing goals, baselines, triggers, and actions, and also a list of roles and responsibilities. Let's talk about trigger levels. Nitrification is controlled by first defining what normal is. And the longer I live, the more I realize what is normal. I know that my life doesn't tend to be normal. And also looking for trends that show the abnormal once we do figure out what baseline is. So therefore, we need initial data. To know what normal is, we need initial data that is not biased or messed up. So if I have nitrification and then I'm trying to use that data to form a baseline, that's a bad idea. In fact, a lot of times when a system has nitrification, they'll do a free chlorine conversion, and then we want them to recollect data to try to establish some baseline, because obviously what they had established before didn't work, right? So that means you need to go back to the drawing board. And additional data must be analyzed to establish hypothetical levels. So we're going to have baseline, and then we're going to set hypothetical goals and triggers. So that's what the data may do, right? So we need to establish our triggers from that, but we need data to do that. So a single result obviously won't work, all right? Comparison helps you see connections in the data, not only per sample location, one sample location, but multiple. So comparing the data from one site multiple times gives you trend analysis. But comparing data from one time at multiple sites, that's at one time, that equals mapping or a snapshot. So goals and baselines equal normal. We would love if everything was normal, right? If our total chlorine residual stayed the same, if our monochloramine was pretty close to our total chlorine, and if our ammonia levels were about 0.05 to 0.1. But in reality, that's more what our data looks like, right? There's some variation in the data. It's not just a consistent number, which we would like. So we can call the average of that normal range our goal or baseline. That's okay. We can use an average. So I like this slide because it refers to like a traffic light. So you think you come to a traffic light, and hopefully, yellow to you doesn't mean go very, very fast, But so green, we're going along good. That's green light means go, everything's good. And then yellow means kind of slow down. Slow down. You hit that yellow trigger, and that you should stop and think about what's going on. Why are we here? Why are we outside of this green area? All right. And then, of course, when we hit red, that's all hands on deck. Stop what you're doing. We're going to go after this and try to find out what's going on. Okay. So you can think of it as a traffic light. It's a good way to do it. These are normal conditions. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this because Alicia covered this a great deal. Normally, this is no nitrification occurring because this is normal for the total chlorine residual to go down over time with water age. It's normal for ammonia levels to slightly go up with time. In fact, if it's going down, then that may mean there's bacteria consuming that ammonia. And then, of course, your nitrite, nitrate, those should be consistent. Those levels should stay the same. So this is no nitrification occurring. All right, so these are normal conditions at 2nd Avenue, right? So that's what you'd establish as normal. All right, so as you can see, there's quite a bit of data here, and this may look something similar to what you do with a spreadsheet. So it's a good idea to take a spreadsheet. Spreadsheet's a great tool. You can enter data in the spreadsheet, and it can do a lot of stuff like standard deviations, averages, mins and maxes, and whatever else, spreadsheet does for us. All right? So setting goals for Second Avenue, we'll graph just for that particular site, okay? Because we want to know what the water quality data looks at that particular site. What if that's pressure plane 1? What if Second Avenue is in pressure plane 1? And you've got 4 pressure planes. And you've got multiple sample locations. So we need to look at individual sites. We need to graph those locations. We need to establish normals for those. Because you've got low, medium, and high water age areas. There's a lot of other things to consider. But you'll notice how this is pretty normal data, all right? I'm kind of hearing a feedback. I don't know if you guys, it's bothering you. But consider chemicals one at a time. And we're talking about total, mono, free available ammonia, nitrite, nitrate. Okay, so you'll notice this is an average. So again, that goal for you may be that average, all right? So you're looking at one particular site, and you're looking at all the total chlorine residuals over time, and that average may be the goal that you establish. Now, notice how with this graph, there's some outliers. We call these outliers, that data point and that data point. I don't know what happened. Maybe somebody's sampling method. One guy had one sampling method, and maybe another had it. Maybe that's the discrepancy. Maybe it's just a valid data point, but it's an outlier, right? So that average kind of puts us right in there. And you can see most of those data points, look where they fall. That's really a consistent average right there. You do have those 2 outliers, but that's not a big thing. So how do you set triggers? Well, you've got yellow flag triggers. And again, that's slow down, take notice, right? When data are somewhat off spec, you are outside, when you're in that yellow trigger, you need to respond by certain actions. And those are actions you establish, system by system. And then red flag is the alarm. That means something seriously off spec. That's when you stop and take serious notice because you're either already in nitrification or you're fastly heading down slope, okay? It's something that needs immediate action. Are both upper and lower triggers needed? Good question. Well, think about this. If you're purchasing water, your total chlorine and monochloramine, having a lower limit is needed. If I'm not booster disinfecting, if I'm just purchasing water and expecting to carry it through my system, then you better believe there's some minimum point for your total chlorine and your monochloramine that you need to be aware of. Because again, once you lose residual, you don't have that disinfection power. And there's a lot of, not only being in non-compliance, but to add the potential of nitrification and other issues. Also, if you're dosing. So if you are booster disinfecting, you need to know, you need to establish minimum and maximum total and mono residuals, okay? What about ammonia? Well, you need upper and lower limits for ammonia, right? If you have an upper limit, that can prevent or avoid feeding bugs, right? If I put too much ammonia, that's fertilizer. I can feed the bugs. And then if I have a lower limit established, that means if I go down below my baseline for ammonia, and does that mean that I've got bacteria that are consuming that ammonia? All right. If my ammonias aren't increasing slightly to the far reaches of my system from the plant, does that mean I've got something consuming that ammonia? Nitrite, upper and lower triggers are needed. Think about this. Early in the establishment of nitrification, Dr. Dill mentioned that nitrite levels increase at the beginning. When nitrification becomes well established, nitrite levels drop and nitrate levels come up. Okay? So it's important to have upper and lower triggers for nitrite, and then, of course, upper triggers you want for nitrate. What's standard deviation? Well, I showed you that graphic, right? And it may be the next slide here that'll explain this. So this spreadsheet took standard deviation as a 0.1. This is the average of residual, 2.8. The first standard deviation is 2.7, and 2.6, you'll notice that is a subtraction of 1/10 from 2.8 on the first standard, and then 2/10 on the second. Okay? All right, so there's your goal, right? That's your goal, 2.8. All right? 2.7, that's the first standard deviation. And that's the second. So green is your goal, yellow is your trigger, and red is your stop immediate action. What actions are appropriate? Well, preventative actions for any kind. I don't care where you are at the traffic light. If it's green and you're going through it, then preventative actions need to be done there. That prevents you from hitting yellow and red triggers, hopefully. Okay? For yellow, do this when levels are outside the green zone. That makes sense. If you go into the yellow zone, you need to respond with yellow triggers. And then when you hit red, it's corrective actions. Do this when you have bad nitrification. All right? We always want to verify results. I mean, you wouldn't make a decision if somebody went out there and said, hey, I've got no residual, and all of you in here, if you're operators, you know as well as I do, I oriented the cuvette wrong in the DR. And or I used plastic when I should have used glass. And so you're always going to do the sample over. That's the first step. Always confirm that the sample technique was done properly. All right? Get samples for nitrite and nitrate. That'll tell you a lot of stuff in terms of do you have nitrification or not. Check for local tap issues. Identify the affected area. Is this system-wide or is this just an isolated area? Okay? I've seen nitrification just in a standpipe. Just in a standpipe. Do valve sweeps. What does that do? Well, crew was repairing a line. They closed the valve to isolate it, and they forgot to open it back up. So I've got a 3 residual over here, just east of 5th Street, and then I go over west of 5th Street, and I'm on the same water main, and I don't have anything. Well, what happened? Well, I just created 2 dead ends because I closed a valve that I wasn't aware of. So do valve sweeps and flush affected areas and do a unidirectional flushing. 5 minutes. Okay. So actions red till levels return to normal. So you're going to kind of stay in that red with DEFCON. Let's just use a movie or the military, for example. Talking about DEFCON levels. You're going to stay at that heightened level until things go back to normal, aren't you? I mean, that just makes sense. You're going to do that until things go back to normal, until you come off the boil water notice. I know that's a bad word. So the primary action used when nitrification is very bad is a temporary chlorine conversion. David Simons, one of the senior engineers that works with me in our program, will be given a presentation on conducting a free chlorine conversion, and he actually made an RG for it. And I believe it's complete. I don't want to steal his thunder, so he'll do that tomorrow. So if you're interested, I want to put a plug out for David. He's an excellent presenter too, by the way. So a NAP, putting it together. Goals, baselines, triggers, and actions. So the NAP includes several things. It includes a map showing sites, that critical sample locations, storage tanks, sources, a sample schedule, the list of analytical methods, a matrix showing goals, baseline, triggers, and actions, a list of roles and responsibilities, maybe who's taking those samples, who's responding to them. This is the matrix here that we're referring to in terms of your nitrification action plan. Hopefully you didn't copy this. Like when we first started getting naps in, it was a little on the side of hilarious because, some of the naps that I'd seen were I was like, wait a minute, this looks familiar. Is this like the example that came out of the you know. And it was the example. They just turned it in. I mean, so this is what your NAP may look like. Again, you've got entry point here, and then, you know, sample locations in the distro, chemicals you're sampling for and you're setting triggers for. And so you'll notice how, look at some of these red actions. So this is just a good example, and there's a lot of this stuff online, and Chris and Alicia will be going over this in detail tomorrow. A NAP is a living document, right? I think I didn't mention this earlier, but a NAP is really like a monitoring plan, but it's really like a process monitoring plan. Could I use that, Alicia?
I like that.
Okay, so it's a process monitoring plan. It's really, you know, if we're not taking these samples and we don't have baselines and triggers established and we're not actually implementing corrective actions, then we're going to find ourselves in an issue. So it's a working document. It should be updated with things change. Are you going to get it right the first time? Hardly any NAP I've ever seen was right the first time. You know, folks had to kind of adjust it and regroup and evaluate it and go back to the drawing board. So the take-home message, again, chloramines are important. They can prevent you from, you know, exceeding DBPs, keep you in compliance. They can keep your customers safe because, again, we are in the public health industry, and we're all about maintaining public health. Nitrification is a potential risk of chloramination, and nitrification can be detected and controlled using a nitrification action plan. And I'll give you one quick example. I know we're almost out of time. I've gone on issues with nitrification where nitrite levels were, you know, above 1 part per million, and nitrate levels were almost darn near 10 parts per million. You know, all those components, nitrite, nitrate, are regulated at entry point. But that doesn't mean that that's not a health risk for Blue Baby, for a child that's in the distribution system where you have elevated nitrite, nitrate. So I've been in situations where it was do not consume order. And that's not fun when customers can't consume water. And I think we wrapped it up.
All right, good stuff. Thank you.